What Japanese generals did when Britain took back Singapore in 1945. September 12, 1945. Singapore. 7 Japanese commanders are walking down St. Andrews Road toward a building they once controlled. At the front is Lieutenant General Seishiro Itagaki. Behind him are 4 other generals and 2 admirals. Their uniforms are immaculate. Their faces reveal almost nothing. But the crowd does. Thousands of people have gathered around the Padang and the Municipal building. For 3.5 years, they have lived under Japanese occupation. Now they watch the men who represented that occupation walk towards surrender. Some in the crowd boo, and the Japanese officers keep walking. But here is the part that makes this moment extraordinary. Less than a month earlier, Japan's emperor had ordered the war to end. For men like Itagaki, that created an impossible command. The Japanese army had spent years teaching its soldiers that surrender was disgraceful. Now the one man they were required to obey above everyone else was ordering them to do exactly that. And Itagaki did not immediately accept it. Before he walked into that building, his own superior had to tell him that the emperor's order would be obeyed. So what happened inside the Japanese command between defeat and this walk? What did generals trained to fight rather than surrender actually do when Britain came back to Singapore? The answer was not a final charge. It was something much more revealing. They obeyed. But first, they had to defeat an enemy inside their own military culture. August 15, 1945. Across Japan's empire, radios are switched on. Soldiers, officers, and civilians hear a voice most of them have never heard before. Emperor Hirohito announces that Japan will accept the Allied terms. He does not deliver the kind of surrender speech Western listeners might expect. The language is formal, indirect. He speaks of the war developing in a way that is not necessarily favorable to Japan. But there is no confusion about what the order means. The fighting is over. For the Imperial Japanese Army, that creates a contradiction that had never been resolved because no one at the top expected to face it. Japanese soldiers had been conditioned to believe that surrender brought shame. Orders from the emperor, however, carried absolute authority. Until August 1945, those 2 ideas had always pointed in the same direction. Fight, do not surrender, obey. Now they pointed against each other. Do not surrender, but obey the emperor who has ordered surrender. And thousands of miles from Tokyo, in Singapore, General Seishiro Itagaki had to decide which command came first. Itagaki was not an obscure officer suddenly trapped by history. He commanded the 7th Area Army, responsible for Japanese forces across a huge portion of Southeast Asia. He had spent decades inside the system that had created the Japanese military empire, and surrender was not the ending men like him had prepared for. According to accounts of those chaotic days, Itagaki was reluctant to comply. But above him stood Field Marshal Count Hisaichi Terauchi, commander of the Southern Army. Terauchi was in Saigon and seriously ill, yet his authority still mattered. By August 18th, Terauchi had ordered Itagaki to accept the emperor's decision and cooperate with the surrender. That changed everything, because now there was no argument left that could be disguised as military duty. The emperor had ordered surrender. Itagaki's commander had repeated the order. The only remaining question was whether the army in Singapore would actually obey. And for several days, nobody on the Allied side could be completely certain that it would. Photographs do not show the weeks that followed the announcement. Japan had surrendered, but in Singapore, no British soldier had yet set foot on a single street. Japanese weapons had not been collected. Japanese guards still stood at the wire. For the men inside Changi, the war had ended in Tokyo, while continuing, hour by hour, where they lived. On August 20th, a rumor moved through the camps. The emperor's voice had been heard, broadcast across the empire. Then another. The guards had been seen weeping. Neither was confirmed. Neither was dismissed. In that uncertainty, an aircraft crossed the sky and dropped leaflets, a message that did not threaten the camp but instructed it. Japan has surrendered. Your treatment will be humane. The prisoners read them in silence. The men who guarded Changi that month faced an order that contradicted everything they had been taught. Surrender was shame. Surrender was death. Yet the voice that had once commanded them to fight now commanded them to stop. Discipline had to hold. If one battalion chose a final gesture, the war would restart locally after the emperor had ended it nationally, and so the most important battle in Singapore was no longer fought between British and Japanese. It was fought between command and collapse. That is the battle Itagaki chose, not a last charge, a handover. To understand why that was psychologically extraordinary, go back exactly 3.5 years. February 15, 1942. This time, a British general is making the humiliating walk. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival leads the delegation that will surrender Singapore to the Japanese. The British position has collapsed. Their water situation is desperate. Their defensive perimeter is shrinking. Percival enters the Ford Motor Factory to face Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita. Japan has achieved one of the most shocking victories of the entire war. Singapore had been presented as a fortress. Instead, it became the site of what Winston Churchill described as Britain's greatest military capitulation. Tens of thousands of Commonwealth troops entered captivity. Across Asia, the political consequences were enormous. The image of European military invincibility had been shattered, and for the Japanese army, Singapore became proof that its methods worked. Speed, aggression, psychological pressure, never admitting weakness, never allowing the enemy to believe you might break. That matters because Singapore was not just another occupied city, it was a symbol. In 1942, British officers had walked toward Japanese commanders to surrender. In 1945, Japanese commanders would be forced to make the opposite journey. Same city, same war, opposite direction. And the British understood the symbolism perfectly. The surrender in September would not be handled quietly. It would be made visible. Britain had spent years planning how Singapore might eventually be recaptured. But Japan's sudden surrender changed those plans. There would be no giant final battle for the island. Instead came reoccupation. The operation was called Tiderace. British naval forces approached Singapore, while Japanese units were being ordered to comply with surrender instructions. Then came the first unmistakable reversal. September 4th, General Itagaki and senior Japanese officers boarded the British cruiser HMS Sussex in Keppel Harbour. 3.5 years earlier, Britain had lost Singapore. Now the Japanese commander of Singapore was stepping onto a British warship to receive surrender terms. No artillery duel, no desperate beachhead, no final Japanese counterattack, just officers, documents and signatures. It is tempting to imagine surrender as one single moment. It wasn't. September 4th was part of the transition. September 12th would be the public conclusion. In between, Allied forces began returning. British and Indian troops came ashore. Japanese control disappeared piece by piece. Military installations were surrendered. Prison camps were opened. And people who had spent years wondering whether the British would ever return began seeing Allied uniforms again. The Japanese generals were still standing, but the empire they had represented was disappearing around them. There are post-war stories of mass suicide, of secret last stands. Some are difficult to verify. They are not needed. What the senior commanders verifiably did was harder to tell, and harder still to perform. They did not fight. They accounted. Officers compiled rosters. Units stood down in formation and laid down their weapons in ordered stacks. Representatives traveled to Allied headquarters to receive instructions. Facilities were inventoried and handed over. The army that had conquered Singapore in 10 days spent its final days performing the quiet, exhaustive labor of disbanding itself. It was administrative. It was also, for every man who performed it, the complete inversion of 4 years of doctrine. The same military that had ordered ordinary soldiers to die rather than surrender now required its generals to prove that obedience outranked preference, that a command to stop was as binding as a command to fight. And beyond the paperwork waited a reality none of the generals could control. Surrender meant inspection. Inspection meant prisoners. Prisoners meant evidence. Singapore had been made to suffer under Japanese rule. Civilians endured shortages, repression, and mass killing. Allied prisoners endured hunger, disease, forced labor, and brutality. Itagaki himself would later be held responsible by the Tokyo Tribunal for the grossly inadequate treatment of prisoners and internees under his authority. The generals were not surrendering territory. They were surrendering control over what the Allies were about to find. Then comes September 12th, the scene that history remembers. The area around the municipal building is packed. People climb to vantage points wherever they can find them. The Padang becomes the stage for a victory ceremony. Aircraft pass overhead. Allied troops stand in formation, and then the Japanese delegation appears. 7 senior officers. General Seishiro Itagaki leads them. With him are senior Army and Navy commanders from the Japanese forces of Southeast Asia. They walk along St. Andrew's Road toward the council chamber. Look closely at photographs of the procession, and there is almost nothing theatrical about the Japanese side. No visible collapse, no pleading, no rage. That restraint is what gives the scene its power. For years, these uniforms had represented authority in Singapore. People had stepped aside for them. People had bowed. People had learned not to challenge Japanese soldiers in the street. Now the crowd could boo, and the generals could do nothing except continue walking. One Singaporean eyewitness later remembered that people jeered because, for the first time, they knew they could get away with it. The balance of fear had reversed. That is the real visual payoff of this story, not the generals being physically dragged into surrender. Nobody needed to drag them. The orders had already done that. Inside the municipal building, the ceremony becomes almost brutally simple. On one side sits Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten, Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia. Around him are senior Allied representatives. Facing them is Itagaki's delegation. Itagaki is not technically surrendering only Singapore. He is acting on behalf of Field Marshal Terauchi and surrendering the Japanese forces of the southern regions to Mountbatten's command. The written terms leave little room for interpretation. Japanese forces are to obey Allied instructions. Any delay or refusal can be punished, and the English version of the document controls if there is disagreement about what the terms mean. There is no negotiation over whether Japan will surrender. That decision has already been made. There is only implementation. Itagaki signs. Again and again. Multiple copies of the surrender instrument pass across the table. Pens move over paper. Cameras record everything. The ceremony takes only minutes. That is one of the strangest contrasts of the entire event. 3.5 years of occupation, years of war across Southeast Asia, hundreds of thousands of men under Japanese Southern Army authority, and the formal act that ends it in Singapore is completed in roughly the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. The fighting had taken years. The signature took minutes. Mountbatten understood that this was more than paperwork. The ceremony had an audience far beyond the men inside the room. Outside were the people of Singapore. Beyond them was Asia. In 1942, the fall of Singapore had damaged British prestige across the region. In 1945, the British wanted the return to be unmistakable. There were guards of honor, aircraft overhead, a victory parade, cameras, journalists, public proclamation. And after the surrender was completed, the Union Jack rose again over Singapore, while the British national anthem played. The symbolism could not have been more deliberate. In 1942, Britain's flag came down. In 1945, Japanese generals signed and watched British authority return. But there is an irony here that makes the ending more complicated than a simple story of empire restored. Britain came back. The old world did not. The Japanese victory of 1942 had exposed how vulnerable European colonial power could be. That lesson could not simply be erased by raising a flag again 3.5 years later. The British had recovered Singapore. They had not recovered 1941. History had already moved, and that brings us back to the photographs. Itagaki, Kimura, Nakamura, Numata. The Japanese admirals and generals walking together. Their faces look controlled. That is important, because popular history often expects defeated commanders to perform defeat for us. We expect rage, tears, a trembling hand, someone throwing papers, someone refusing to sign. History is rarely that convenient. The Japanese officers at Singapore had spent entire careers learning emotional control. What happened to them was not written clearly across their faces. It was written in what they were doing. A Japanese general did not need to cry for surrender to be humiliating. He only needed to sign. The same military establishment that had treated capitulation as disgraceful now had its senior officers placing their names beneath an unconditional surrender document. The uniforms remained immaculate. The discipline remained. The hierarchy remained. But the purpose of that hierarchy had completely reversed. Yesterday it existed to continue the war. Now it existed to stop it. That is what makes the Singapore surrender psychologically different from the dramatic final battle many people imagine. Japan's senior commanders in Singapore did not prove their devotion by dying. They proved their obedience by living long enough to carry out the order. So what did Japanese generals do when Britain took back Singapore? First, they faced an order they had spent their careers believing should never be necessary. Some resisted the idea, but their chain of command settled the question. The emperor had spoken. Terauchi ordered compliance. Itagaki complied. Then the commanders did something far more difficult than one last reckless attack. They controlled an armed military force through defeat. They dealt with allied representatives. They surrendered installations. They permitted returning forces to land. They walked publicly through a crowd that no longer feared them. And finally, they signed. That sequence matters because it exposes what was really at the center of Imperial Japanese military discipline. The refusal to surrender was powerful, but obedience was stronger. When those two principles finally collided in August 1945, obedience won. That does not mean every Japanese soldier everywhere immediately accepted defeat. The collapse of the Japanese Empire was chaotic, and surrender unfolded differently across an enormous geographic area. But in Singapore, the senior command ultimately held. No Battle of Singapore, 1945, followed the Battle of Singapore, 1942. The city changed hands because the Japanese command implemented surrender. And that may have required a different kind of discipline from the one that had conquered it. There is one final image worth holding. February 1942. Arthur Percival walks toward surrender. September 1945. Seishiro Itagaki walks toward surrender. 3.5 years separate them. In the first scene, Japanese victory looks permanent. In the second, it has vanished completely. That is why Singapore is one of the most perfect reversals of the Second World War. The city did not simply change owners twice. It forced two military systems to confront the same humiliation from opposite sides. In 1942, Britain learned that an empire could collapse much faster than anyone imagined. In 1945, Japanese generals learned something equally brutal. A military culture can tell a man that surrender is worse than death. It can repeat that lesson for years. It can build tactics, rituals, and identity around it. But eventually, every military system reaches the same final question. Who gives the last order? For Itagaki and the men walking beside him, the answer was the emperor. So 7 commanders continued up the steps. The crowd watched. The documents waited. And inside that building, men who had spent their careers serving an army that said never surrender did exactly that. Not because they had suddenly stopped believing in obedience, because they still believed in it. And in the end, the order to surrender came from the one authority they had been taught they could never refuse. The British flag went back up. The generals walked away, and Singapore's war was over. If you come to World War II legacy for the decisions and moments behind the battles, the stories that show how wars actually ended, subscribe. Because sometimes the most revealing moment in a war is not when an army attacks. It is what its generals do when they are finally told to stop.